We now move into the more recent past, the time of the last 500 million years. As we move to more and more recent time, there are more and more archives that allow us to reconstruct what climate was like. These include ice cores and tree rings, ocean and lake sediments, corals, fossils, glacial features, boreholes, and stalagmites growing in caves. Not all of these archives cover the entirety of the last 500 million years. In fact, almost none of them do. But all of them give us essential insights into past climates. Some archives allow us to make estimates of past CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. These pictures show images that relate to some of these archives. One is fossil leaf stomata on the upper left here. Stomata are the openings in leaves that allow plants to take in air, to bring in CO2 for photosynthesis, and also to release oxygen that's a product of photosynthesis. In the process, they also lose water, and as a result, plants tend to optimize the number of leaf cells that are stomata for the given atmospheric CO2 concentration. That is, at high CO2 concentrations, when plants can bring in a small amount of air and still have plenty of carbon for photosynthesis, they tend to have fewer of their leaf cells be stomata. And so by counting how many stomata there are on a leaf relative to its total number of cells, scientists can make estimates of past CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Other archives, which I'll discuss in less detail, include carbonate nodules in ancient soils. Some of those are shown here. And some of these ancient soils preserved in ancient sedimentary beds are shown in this image. In the ocean, plankton growing in the sea surface that create shells made of calcium carbonate also preserve something about the chemistry of that ancient seawater. And from measurements of the chemistry of these shells, we can make estimates of the carbon dioxide concentration in the surface water. And from that, we can make estimates of the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere above it. Taking these estimates together, we have a variety of estimates for CO2 concentrations in ancient atmospheres, which are shown here. Although there's a fair amount of discrepancy between the different records, we get general agreement that there was low CO2 at this time around 300 million years ago, and that the last 40 or 50 million years has been a time of relatively low CO2 as well. In the middle are these times of quite high CO2 in the thousands of ppm. Also prior to 300 million years ago, there appears to have been quite high atmospheric CO2. In the green shading is shown a geochemical model that's used to estimate past CO2 concentrations based upon evidence preserved in ancient sediments and volcanic rocks about changes in the inputs and outputs of carbon from the ocean atmosphere system over time. Shown at the top in these blue bars are estimates of the extent of glaciation throughout the last 400 million years. As we see, extensive glaciation is confined to really two periods in the last 400 million years. First of all, the last 30 million years, and secondly, this period around 300 million years ago, a time called the Late Paleozoic Ice Age. Interestingly, both of these periods of extensive glaciation correspond with periods of fairly low PCO2. To get more detailed information about temperature and ice volume, we turn to oxygen isotopes. The dominant isotope of oxygen is oxygen-16. The next most abundant oxygen isotope is oxygen-18, which just has 2 extra neutrons. We express the ratio of oxygen-18 to oxygen-16 using so-called delta notation, in which the ratio of the sample is divided by the ratio of a common standard. We subtract 1 to express the deviation, and then multiply by 1,000 to put it in easy-to-manage units, and we express it in units of per mil, or tenths of a percent. This delta notation is used for oxygen isotopes, carbon isotopes, hydrogen isotopes, and other isotope systems. There are a few reasons why there are variations in oxygen isotope compositions. One is that heavier isotopes tend to form stronger atomic bonds. Shown here is a plot of bond strength for different hydrogen isotopes, and we see that the heavier isotopes form bonds that require more energy to break. As a result, as a general rule of thumb, oxygen 18 tends to be enriched in the strongest bonds, that is, in the most immobile state. Because of this difference, we observe strong relationships between the temperature of calcification and the oxygen isotope composition of calcium carbonate. Shown here are results from early work in which small marine plankton known as foraminifera that grow in the surface ocean and as well as at depth were cultured in the lab at varying temperatures. Shown on the horizontal axis is the difference between the delta 18 of the carbonate and that of the water in which it grew. And so we see at higher and higher temperatures, the calcium carbonate tends to have less and less oxygen 18 relative to oxygen 16. This method has been extensively applied to estimate past temperatures of seawater. Shown here are results from so-called benthic foraminifera. These are foraminifera that live on the seafloor, and they record the temperature and composition of deep sea waters. Time here is going from the right to the left, from about 65 million years ago toward the present. We see that early on in this time period, delta 18 recorded in these benthic foraminifera is quite negative, and that values become steadily more positive through time. Using the relationship shown in the past slide, these can be related to temperature for at least part of the record. And so the early part of this shift towards more positive values would signal declining temperatures in the deep sea towards values that are closer to the modern values of something like 1 to 2 degrees C. As you see, though, values become increasingly positive through time, so positive that they extend beyond the freezing point of seawater. And so some other process must be at play. And this has to do with the buildup of ice sheets, first in Antarctica and then in the northern hemisphere, with time. When water vapor evaporates from seawater, it tends to be depleted in oxygen 18 relative to oxygen 16. This is related to the fact that water molecules containing oxygen 18 are simply heavier, so even with the same kinetic energy, they have a lower velocity. Then when that water vapor starts to condense out water and rain it out into the sea below, water molecules in that water vapor containing oxygen 18 are more likely to condense for the same reason. And so as more and more water rains out of that water vapor, the water vapor becomes more and more depleted in oxygen 18 relative to oxygen 16. By the time this water vapor goes along a long transport path to a high latitude site like Antarctica, it's lost a large amount of its oxygen 18, and so has a very negative delta 18. Because of this, ice sheets are not built from a representative sampling of the oxygen isotope composition of the sea around them. Instead, they have quite negative delta 18 compositions. And as a result, buildup of ice tends to enrich the remaining ocean in O18 because the ice is depleted in O18. And so returning to this plot, as ice sheet starts to grow, not only does the deep sea become colder, but also the composition of the ocean itself, in which these foraminifera are growing, becomes more positive. And so this shift towards more positive values over the last 35 million years is in part a story about declining deep sea temperatures, and is in part about increasing ice volume through this time. So how does this relate to CO2 in the atmosphere? In this figure, we see a compilation of estimates of atmospheric CO2 concentrations over the last 65 million years. Note that the time axis is reversed from the last slide, so time now moves from left to right. So in tandem with this cooling of the deep sea and of global climate, and of the growing of ice volume, we see a decline in CO2 concentrations. Similarly, the time of warmest temperatures, around 40 to 50 million years ago, is the time that appears to have the highest CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, something around 1,000 ppm. We see that there's a good deal of noise in the data. Not all of the proxy estimates agree with each other. pointing out the need for further refinement of methods for estimating the CO2 concentration of the ancient atmosphere. But overall, we see a pattern in which cooler climates are systematically associated with lower CO2.